Maria Miller was born free in Hartford, Connecticut in 1803. Her parents' names have been lost to history, but we know their surname was Miller, and we know they were free black people in a nation where most people who looked like them were enslaved. By the age of 5, both of Maria's parents were dead. She was left with nothing, no inheritance, no family, just a 5-year-old girl in a world that had very specific plans for children like her. Maria became an indentured servant in the household of a white clergyman. For the next 10 years, from age 5 to 15, she worked for this minister's family. She received no formal education. None was offered, none was expected. But Maria Miller had what she would later describe as a soul that thirsted for knowledge. While the family slept, while she was supposed to be working, she would sneak books from the minister's library. She taught herself to read. She taught herself to write. She absorbed everything she could find, storing it away, building the foundation for a voice that would eventually shake Boston's abolitionist community. At 15, her indenture ended. Maria left the minister's household and supported herself through domestic work, the occupation available to most black women in early 19th century New England. But she continued her education, attending what were called Sabbath schools, Sunday schools that offered religious instruction alongside basic literacy and mathematics. For 5 more years, Maria worked as a servant and studied whenever she could. She was building something, though she probably didn't know what yet. In 1826, at age 23, Maria Miller married James W. Stewart. The wedding took place on August 10th at the African Baptist Church in Boston. James Stewart was 44 years old, 21 years older than his bride. He was a shipping agent, a man who had served in the War of 1812 and spent time as a prisoner of war in England. After the war, he'd built a successful business fitting out whaling and fishing vessels. James Stewart had done what very few black men in America could do in 1826. He'd achieved financial stability and a measure of independence. With her marriage, Maria became part of something remarkable. Boston's free black community in the 1820s made up only about 3% of the city's population, and within that small community, there was an even smaller group, a black middle class that was beginning to build institutions and organize for change. The Stewarts lived on the north slope of Beacon Hill, the heart of Boston's black neighborhood. They attended services at the African Baptist Church, located in the African Meeting House. They joined the Massachusetts General Colored Association, one of the first organizations dedicated to the immediate abolition of slavery. This was where Maria Stewart met David Walker. Walker was a radical voice in the abolitionist movement, a man whose words would influence her thinking forever. In 1829, he published a document called Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World. This wasn't the polite, gradualist, anti-slavery writing that white abolitionists preferred. Walker's appeal was a thunderbolt. He denounced the racism embedded in American slavery. He attacked Thomas Jefferson's written claims that black people were inferior. He called on African Americans, both enslaved and free, to use self-defense to protect themselves from degradation. The pamphlet was so inflammatory that southern states banned its distribution. Georgia placed a bounty on Walker's head. Walker's appeal spread through an underground network. Sailors carried copies south, sewn into the linings of clothing. And James Stewart, with his connections in the shipping business, may have been part of that network, helping to smuggle copies of Walker's dangerous words into the heart of slave territory. Maria Stewart absorbed Walker's message. She saw in his writing a fusion of religious conviction and political radicalism that spoke to something deep inside her. The Stewarts knew Walker personally. They were friends. And when the Walkers moved out of their home at what's now 81 Joy Street, the Stewarts moved in. For a brief moment, Maria Stewart had stability. She had a husband, a home, a community, and a growing sense of purpose shaped by the radical politics swirling through Boston's black activist circles. Then everything fell apart. In December 1829, just 3 years after they married, James Stewart died. The marriage had produced no children. James left Maria what should have been a substantial inheritance, enough money to support her for years. But the white executors of his will had other plans. They claimed the money. They took her to court. For 2 years, Maria Stewart fought them, trying to reclaim what her husband had left her. She lost. The executors, as one of her friends would later put it, literally robbed and cheated her out of every cent. 30 years old, widowed, childless, and now penniless, Maria Stewart was forced back into domestic service. She was right back where she'd started, working in other people's homes, cooking and cleaning for survival. Just months after her husband's death, David Walker died too. Officially, the cause was consumption, the disease we now call tuberculosis. But some suspected foul play. Walker's daughter died of the same illness around the same time. His friends wondered if someone had poisoned him for writing the appeal. In the space of a few months, Maria Stewart lost her husband, her financial security, and her political mentor. Lesser people would have been destroyed. Maria Stewart was transformed. In 1830, she underwent what she described as a religious conversion. She dedicated herself to God's service. But for Stewart, religious devotion and political activism were inseparable. She resolved, as she later wrote, to become a strong advocate for the cause of God and for the cause of freedom. She would take up where David Walker had left off. In 1831, William Lloyd Garrison was running a new abolitionist newspaper called The Liberator. Garrison was 26 years old, a white man with radical ideas about immediate emancipation. That year, he published an advertisement asking for writings by black women. Maria Stewart answered. She delivered a manuscript to his office, a collection of devotional writings and essays about the racism endured by black people. Garrison was impressed. That summer, he published her work as a pamphlet titled Religion and the Pure Principles of Morality, the sure foundation on which we must build. The essay was electric. Stewart wrote with the thundering rhetorical power she'd learned from David Walker, but she directed her message specifically to black women. She asked how long the fair daughters of Africa would be compelled to bury their minds and talents beneath loads of iron pots and kettles. She called for black people to unite, to build stores of their own, to possess the spirit of independence. These were radical words in 1831, and they marked Maria Stewart as someone to watch. The success of that first pamphlet led to more writing. In 1832, Stewart published Meditations from the pen of Mrs. Maria W. Stewart, a 28-page collection of prayers and meditations. But writing wasn't enough. Stewart felt called to speak, to address audiences directly, to use her voice the way preachers used theirs. There was just one problem. Women didn't give public speeches. It wasn't done. Speaking in public, especially to mixed audiences that included men, was considered improper, unseemly, almost immoral. The word used at the time was promiscuous, meaning a mixing of the sexes that violated social norms. In April 1832, Maria Stewart gave her first public address. She spoke to the African American Female Intelligence Society, a women's organization in Boston. The audience was entirely female, which made the speech slightly less scandalous by the standards of the day. Stewart talked about religion, about the importance of faith and education for black women. The speech went well enough that she decided to do it again. On September 21, 1832, Maria Stewart walked into Franklin Hall in Boston and did something that had never been documented before in American history. She addressed a mixed audience, men and women together, black and white people in the same room, and she spoke to them about politics, about slavery, about the conditions facing free black people in the North. Her speech was titled, "Why Sit Ye Here and Die?" and it pulled no punches. Stewart stood before that mixed audience and told them that free black people in the North were barely better off than enslaved people in the South. She said most people of color had dragged out miserable existences of servitude from cradle to grave. She asked what literary achievements could be made when black children were forced into labor instead of school. She looked at the white people in the audience and demanded they acknowledge their role in perpetuating this system. She looked at black men and challenged them to do more, to fight harder for their own advancement. The speech was published in The Liberator. Boston's abolitionist community was buzzing. Some were inspired, others were scandalized. A woman had spoken publicly to men about political issues. This was unprecedented, and not everyone was ready for it. But Maria Stewart wasn't finished. On February 27, 1833, she delivered her third public address at the African Masonic Hall in Boston. This speech was titled African Rights and Liberty, and it went further than anything she'd said before. Stewart defended her right to speak publicly, invoking examples of accomplished women throughout history. Then she turned her attention to black men in the audience. She told them they were abundantly capable of making themselves men of distinction, but their gross neglect made her blood boil. She said if the men who'd had opportunities had turned their attention to mental and moral improvement instead of gambling and dancing, she could have remained quietly at home, and they could have stood in her place. Stewart was saying, essentially, that she wouldn't have to be up there speaking if the men had done their jobs. The room erupted. The response to Stewart's speeches was overwhelming and mostly negative. Even people who supported abolition, who agreed with her politics, couldn't accept a woman speaking this way in public. She'd crossed too many lines. She'd criticized black male leaders. She'd claimed authority in spaces traditionally reserved for men. She'd defended herself instead of remaining silent in the face of criticism. The backlash was intense. We know from Stewart's own later writings that she encountered opposition even from her Boston circle of friends. People told her she was improper, immodest, unwomanly. The criticism came from white people who thought no woman should speak publicly, and it came from black people who thought she was damaging their cause by being too aggressive, too confrontational, too visible. On September 21, 1833, exactly 1 year after her Franklin Hall speech, Maria Stewart delivered her fourth and final public address in Boston. She called it her farewell address to her friends in the city of Boston. In it, she acknowledged that by lecturing publicly, she had made herself contemptible in the eyes of many. She admitted it felt like laboring in vain. Her life, she said, had been almost a life of complete disappointment, but she refused to apologize for following what she believed was God's call. Shortly after that speech, Maria Stewart left Boston. She moved to New York City in late 1833 or early 1834. She joined a black female literary society and found work teaching in public schools in Manhattan and later on Long Island. She continued her political work, attending the Women's Anti-Slavery Convention of 1837, staying connected to the abolitionist movement. But she never gave another public lecture the way she had in Boston. The cost had been too high. In 1835, William Lloyd Garrison published a collection of her speeches and writings titled Productions of Mrs. Maria W. Stewart. It contained her 4 lectures, her essays, and some of her poems. The book reached a wider audience than her speeches ever had, and something remarkable happened. Within a year of its publication, other women began to follow the path Stewart had opened. White women, like the Grimke sisters, started lecturing in churches and meeting halls. Black and white women began speaking publicly on abolition, on women's rights, on social reform. They faced similar backlash, similar accusations of impropriety, but the ground had been broken. Maria Stewart had proven it could be done, but Stewart herself continued to struggle. In 1852, she moved to Baltimore, where she taught private pupils for money. She later wrote that she was never very shrewd in money matters, and having been classed as a lady all her life without exposure to hardship, she didn't know how to manage. She was barely surviving, earning 50 cents a month while white teachers earned $1. In 1861, as the Civil War began and enslaved families started fleeing north to Washington, D.C., Stewart moved to the capital and opened a school. She taught the children of refugees, people escaping slavery, looking for safety and education in a city that was becoming a haven for freed people. Stewart taught throughout the war. She witnessed the transformation of Washington as thousands of formerly enslaved people arrived, seeking new lives. By the early 1870s, Stewart had been appointed head matron at the Freedmen's Hospital and Asylum in Washington. The hospital was established by the Freedmen's Bureau, the federal agency created to help formerly enslaved people transition to freedom. The position Stewart held had previously been occupied by Sojourner Truth, another black woman who'd used her voice to fight for freedom and justice. Stewart managed the housekeeping staff at a facility that had room for 300 patients and served not just as a hospital, but as a refugee camp for people displaced by slavery and war. She lived and worked at the hospital. She continued to teach, running a Sunday school for the community. She kept writing, kept thinking, kept working for the cause she'd dedicated her life to decades earlier. But by the late 1870s, Maria Stewart was in her 70s and still living in poverty. Then in 1878, a new law was passed. It granted pensions to widows of War of 1812 veterans. Maria Stewart suddenly realized she was eligible. Her husband, James, had served in that war, had been a prisoner in England, had come home and built a life. And now, nearly 50 years after his death, Maria could finally receive something for his service. A friend named Louise C. Hatton helped Stewart gather the documents, the testimonies, the evidence needed to claim the pension. It was approved, $8 a month. Stewart used the money and some retroactive payments to republish her work. She added new material about her experiences during the Civil War and published an expanded edition of Meditations from the pen of Mrs. Maria W. Stewart in December 1879. She wanted people to know her story, to understand what she'd fought for, to see the through line from her early speeches in Boston to her work with freed people in Washington. On December 17, 1879, Maria Stewart died at Freedmen's Hospital. She was 76 years old. She died in the same building where she'd worked, among the people she'd served. The obituary in the People's Advocate, a Washington black newspaper, acknowledged that few people knew about her remarkable career. For half a century, it said, she'd been engaged in the work of elevating her race through lectures, teaching, and various missionary and benevolent labors. Maria Stewart was originally buried in Graceland Cemetery in Washington on December 17, 1879, exactly 50 years to the day after her husband's death. When the cemetery closed in the 1890s, her remains were moved to Woodlawn Cemetery, which was later added to the National Register of Historic Places. Here's what makes Maria Stewart's story so important. She wasn't the first black woman to write about abolition or religion. She wasn't even the first black woman to have her work published. But she was the first American woman, black or white, to leave documented evidence of speaking publicly on political issues to mixed audiences. That Franklin Hall speech in 1832 broke a barrier that had seemed unbreakable, and she paid for it with public humiliation and exile from the city where she'd built her political voice. Stewart's speeches and writings did something revolutionary. They fused religious language with political radicalism in a way that made both more powerful. She learned this from David Walker, but she extended his ideas, directing them specifically toward black women and making arguments about gender equality that were decades ahead of their time. She told black women they had minds worth cultivating and talents worth developing. She told them they shouldn't accept lives of endless servitude and limitation. And she told black men they needed to recognize women as intellectual and political equals. The backlash Stewart faced reveals the multiple forces constraining black women in the 1830s. White society told them they couldn't speak publicly because they were women. But within black communities, Stewart also faced resistance from men who felt threatened by a woman claiming public authority, and from other community members who worried that her aggressive rhetoric would damage the abolitionist cause. She was trapped between racism from white society and sexism from her own community, fighting battles on multiple fronts simultaneously. Stewart's insistence on speaking despite this opposition established a precedent. When the Grimke sisters started lecturing a few years later, they faced similar opposition, but they could point to Maria Stewart's example. When Sojourner Truth began her speaking career, she was building on ground Stewart had broken. When Frances Ellen Watkins Harper became one of the most prominent black speakers of the later 19th century, she was walking a path Stewart had mapped out decades earlier. The connections between Stewart's early activism and the later women's rights movement are direct. The first women's rights convention in Seneca Falls in 1848 grew out of women abolitionists' frustration with the limitations placed on their participation. Those women had watched how Stewart was treated. They'd seen what happened when women claimed public voices, and they decided to fight back, to demand rights not just for enslaved people but for women of all races. Stewart's life after Boston also matters. She didn't retreat into silence after her public speaking career ended. She taught for nearly 50 years. She educated hundreds, maybe thousands of children and adults, black people seeking literacy and knowledge in a society that tried to deny them both. Her work in Washington during and after the Civil War put her at the center of one of the most transformative moments in American history, the moment when 4 million enslaved people became legally free and needed education, health care, and support. The fact that Stewart died in poverty tells us something about how America treated its pioneers. She'd broken barriers, influenced generations of activists, dedicated her life to education and justice, and she died with an $8 a month pension that she only received in the last year of her life. The system she'd fought against her entire life gave her almost nothing in return. but Stewart's ideas survived. Her speeches were preserved in The Liberator and in the collection Garrison published. Scholars rediscovered her work in the 20th century as Black history, and women's studies emerged as academic fields. Her writings appear in anthologies of African American literature and feminist thought. She's recognized now as a foundational figure in multiple movements: abolition, women's rights, Black political thought, and the tradition of Black women's activism. Maria Stewart lived through 60 years of the most transformative period in African American history. She was born when slavery was legal everywhere in the South, and most Black people in the North faced severe restrictions on their freedom. She lived to see the Civil War, emancipation, and the early years of Reconstruction. She witnessed the destruction of slavery as a legal institution and the beginning of new struggles for civil rights and equal treatment. Her trajectory from orphaned servant girl to published writer and public speaker to educator of freed people embodies the possibilities and limitations facing Black women in 19th century America. She achieved things that should have been impossible. She used her voice when she was supposed to be silent. She claimed authority when she was supposed to defer. She criticized powerful people when she was supposed to be grateful for whatever scraps of opportunity she received, and she paid the price. The Boston speaking career that should have been the beginning of something larger instead lasted just 18 months before public pressure forced her out. The financial security she should have inherited from her husband was stolen by white executors who knew a Black widow couldn't effectively fight them in court. The recognition she deserved for her groundbreaking work didn't come until more than a century after her death. Stewart's story forces us to think about whose voices get heard and whose get silenced, whose contributions get remembered and whose get forgotten. For decades, histories of the abolitionist movement focused on white men like Garrison and Wendell Phillips, occasionally mentioning Frederick Douglass or Sojourner Truth, but ignoring the Black women who helped build the movement from the beginning. Maria Stewart was there in the early 1830s, speaking and writing before most of the more famous abolitionists began their work, but her story nearly disappeared. The recovery of her voice matters because it changes our understanding of history. It shows us that Black women were intellectuals, political theorists, and public activists decades earlier than we thought. It reveals the connections between anti-slavery work and early feminism. It demonstrates how religious language could be weaponized against oppression rather than used to justify it. Stewart's fusion of Christianity and political radicalism deserves particular attention. She was speaking in an era when most churches in America supported slavery or stayed silent about it. Southern churches explicitly defended slavery using biblical texts. Northern churches often preached gradual emancipation or colonization, sending free Black people to Africa rather than demanding justice in America. Against this backdrop, Stewart used the same biblical language to argue for immediate emancipation, for Black self-determination, for women's equality. She showed that Scripture could be read in revolutionary ways by people committed to liberation. Her relationship with David Walker also illuminates something important about intellectual networks in early Black activism. Walker's appeal influenced a whole generation of activists, but historians have often focused on its impact on men, on Henry Highland Garnet, and other male abolitionists who cited it. Stewart's work shows us that Black women were also reading Walker, engaging with his ideas, extending and adapting them for different audiences and purposes. She took Walker's call for Black resistance and directed it toward women, arguing that Black women needed to resist not just slavery and racism, but also the gender restrictions that limited their potential. Think about what it meant for Stewart to stand in Franklin Hall in 1832 and address that mixed audience. She knew she was violating every rule of proper behavior for women. She knew people would attack her. She did it anyway because she believed the message was more important than her reputation. She believed that black people needed to hear what she had to say, and that white people needed to be confronted with truths they preferred to ignore. And what did she tell them? She told them that free black people in the North were trapped in a system almost as oppressive as slavery. She was talking about structural racism before that term existed. She was describing how even legally free black people faced discrimination in employment, education, housing, and every other aspect of life. She was making connections between Northern racism and Southern slavery, showing how both were part of the same system of oppression. This was dangerous rhetoric in 1832. Many white Northerners liked to think they were morally superior to slaveholding Southerners. Stewart was telling them they were complicit in a different form of the same evil. Many black Northerners wanted to emphasize their differences from enslaved people, to prove they were respectable and deserving of rights. Stewart was saying the difference didn't matter as much as they thought, that racism targeted all black people regardless of their legal status. Her criticism of black men in her February 1833 speech was equally provocative. She was saying that black male leaders had failed their communities by not fighting hard enough for advancement, by getting distracted by frivolous pursuits, by not recognizing and supporting the capabilities of black women. This wasn't the message black male leaders wanted to hear, especially from a woman in a public forum. But Stewart wasn't trying to be diplomatic. She was trying to tell the truth as she saw it. And she believed that truth-telling was more important than maintaining harmony or protecting egos. She was willing to make enemies if that's what speaking truth required. The fact that her public career was destroyed by criticism from within her own community, not primarily from hostile whites, says something painful about how oppressed communities sometimes police their own members. The people who forced Stewart to stop speaking weren't slave owners or pro-slavery politicians. They were Boston black abolitionists who thought she was damaging the cause, being too aggressive, overstepping her bounds as a woman. They silenced one of their own most powerful voices because she made them uncomfortable. This pattern repeats throughout history. Radical voices within movements for justice often face their harshest criticism from moderates within their own communities who think the radicals are going too far, too fast, in ways that will alienate potential allies. Stewart faced this in 1833. Later activists faced similar dynamics. The tension between radical and moderate approaches to social change is never simple, and it often costs movements their most visionary leaders. Stewart's later life teaching in New York, Baltimore, and Washington was valuable work, but it wasn't what she could have been doing if she'd been allowed to continue her public speaking career. We can only imagine what she might have accomplished with another 40 years as a lecturer and activist. What movements might she have influenced? What other barriers might she have broken? What other women might she have inspired? Instead, she taught children to read and write. She helped families escaping slavery adjust to freedom. She managed housekeeping at a hospital serving formerly enslaved people. This was important work. It was necessary work, but it was also the work available to black women in the 19th century, the work they were allowed to do, the work that kept them out of public view and limited their influence. The $8 a month pension Stewart finally received in 1878 is almost insulting when you think about what she'd contributed. Her husband had served in a war more than 60 years earlier, and it took a new law and the help of a friend to get her even that small amount. She'd worked her entire adult life. She'd broken barriers, educated generations, shaped political movements, and America gave her $8 a month in the last year of her life. But Stewart used what she had. She took that pension money and published her work one more time, making sure her story would survive, that her words would be available to future generations. She died in December 1879, just after the book was published. It's as if she held on long enough to complete that final task, to ensure her voice wouldn't be completely erased from history. Maria Stewart's legacy lives in every woman who speaks publicly about injustice. It lives in the tradition of Black women's political thought and activism that runs from her through Sojourner Truth, through Ida B. Wells, through Ella Baker, through Barbara Jordan, through Shirley Chisholm, through all the Black women who have used their voices to demand change. It lives in the intersectional analysis that recognizes how racism and sexism compound each other, creating unique challenges for women of color. It lives in the understanding that liberation requires confronting multiple forms of oppression simultaneously. Stewart showed us that breaking barriers requires courage, that speaking truth costs something, that the people who go first often pay the highest price. She showed us that religious faith can fuel radical politics rather than pacifying believers. She showed us that education is a form of resistance, that literacy is power, that knowledge matters. She showed us that women's voices belong in public discourse about the most important issues facing society, regardless of what tradition or propriety or criticism might say. In 1832, Maria Stewart walked into Franklin Hall and changed American history. She spoke when women weren't supposed to speak. She challenged her audience when she was supposed to be grateful for their tolerance. She claimed authority when she was supposed to defer. She created a record of her words when many people wanted her silenced. And because she did these things, because she refused to accept the limitations placed on her, the path opened just slightly for the women who came after her. Not enough, never enough, but something. A crack in the wall that others could widen, a precedent that others could cite, a life that proved what was possible, even at tremendous personal cost. That's Maria Stewart's story. Not a fairy tale about triumph over adversity, but the truth about what it cost one Black woman to use her voice in a nation that didn't want to hear it, and what she accomplished anyway.